Thank you for these kind words. So I'm very pleased and honored to be here to speak about the topic on the genus Orchids in general, but with more particular aspects, as we will see. I must say that I have been studying the orchids of Portugal since the year 1983, and so I had the opportunity to travel a lot through the country, almost every year, and sometimes twice a year since that year. But nevertheless, every time I return to Portugal, new discoveries are possible. Just as an example, this one, on this picture, you can see something that I saw for the first time in Portugal is Cephalantera longifolia. Cephalantera longifolia looks like this. It has green leaves normally, but there are some individuals which lack totally chlorophyll and are therefore myco-heterotrophic. They depend on fungi for their alimentation. So that's the first time yesterday that I saw this in the Serra de São Luís. And it is of actuality because Fabiana, you know, one of our colleagues from France, he's a specialist of those plants, and I sent him an email, but saying that unfortunately I didn't have the material that would allow me to uptake what would be necessary for him to study further the question. But he was happy to know that.
And you need permission from the Nature Conservation Council.
Sorry?
You need permission from the Nature Conservation
Yes, normally I would need permission. I know. And yes, that's, I know more and more we need permissions, and that's really a constraint, sometimes a heavy constraint for us researchers. Because you cannot guess in advance that you will find such a thing in nature. You cannot plan to ask for permissions. May I have the permission to take leaves from a plant that maybe I could find in one of those years? That's really a tricky point in research. So now let me start with the subject of today. Remind that I'm a member of Université catholique Louvain, the Earth and Life Institute, Biodiversity Research Center, as Anna mentioned, and I have a small team of researchers called Orchid Research Group, of which we have one more representative here today, is Fabiana Esposito, who sits in the back and who is a PhD researcher on a genus of orchids, the genus Platantera. So the outline of my speech today will be this one. So the general context we will see, I will remind you what were the consequences of the advent of molecular phylogenetics, especially in particular for orchids, and more particularly for what happened to the genus Orchis. Then these are the points that I will develop in during the speech, and to come to a conclusion, to try to have a conclusion, because as you saw, I mentioned subgenera Masculae and Orchis in the title, but with a few others, I think that we could speak of real genera in that case. And that is what I will try to explain. So, first, very quickly the consequences of the advent of molecular phylogenetics. There is a so-called Angiosperm phylogeny group who reconsidered the classification of all flowering plants, Angiosperms. And to see the orchids in that context, we must recall that thanks to that research on molecular phylogenetics, the dicotyledons are no longer a monophyletic set, while the monocotyledons still remains monophyletic. But now you can see the monocotyledons appear in the middle of the classification, and inside of it, the orchids belong to the class of Asparagale, which is outside of the order of Liliales, for example. Although previously the orchids were thought to be closely related with Liliales, but this is no longer the case. And if we look at the Asparagales, we see that orchids are at the basis of the clade, and so this is one of the most ancient families in that part of the classification. And indeed, orchids have been shown to trace back as far as 75 to 84 millions of years. So they are an ancient family, contrary to what is generally thought. And I used to say that orchids have seen the last dinosaurs. The last dinosaurs were able to see the first orchids appearing. Now, in orchids, there are 5 subfamilies that were confirmed by molecular phylogenetics, which appear in that way, with the most primitive one being the Apostasioidae, then the Vanilloidae, the Cypripedioidae, and the last 2 with the most numerous species are Orchidoidae and Epidendroidae. And by the way, in Portugal we find only representatives of these 2 subfamilies. As well as in most of Europe. In Europe, in addition, there are few representatives of Cypripedioidae. So this is the idea of that classification was the intent for the logo of our research group. The logo of the Orchid Research Group is based on this subdivision into 5 subfamilies. Just maybe a digression to remind what can be found in Portugal. This is a digression. This is a graph showing the relative richness in orchid species in different territories, either continental territories or islands. And you can see that Portugal, as well as Belgium, lie in the middle of the classification, with the richest countries being Italy, Greece, and France, and curiously Liechtenstein as a 4th. And the poorest territories being the remote Atlantic islands, Canaries and Madeira. And this is to show that research in orchids is still active, and that every year new species are described or discovered at the rates indicated in the last column. So in 2007 there were 61 species recorded for Portugal, but now there we have 65 species recorded for Portugal. But of course the number of species depends on the conceptions of the species that you have. If we take a lumped concept, maybe we would see only 35 or 40 species of orchids in Portugal, but some genera were more developed than others. For example, Orchis. I consider 19 species for Portugal, but if you see other conceptions, you will find maybe 5 or 4 different species. If you group all Fusca like species as only one species, then you lose already 7 or 8 species. So this is really relative. Now let me return to the main subject. So before 97, the genus Orchis sensulato, included a conglomerate of species which were obviously recognized as heterogeneous on the morphological point of view, but also due to the fact that they had different chromosome numbers and that some parts of them hybridize among themselves, but not with the rest of the genus. So we had already the intuition that this genus Orchis was polyphyletic, and indeed molecular phylogenetics confirmed that it is strongly polyphyletic or paraphyletic. In 97 came 2 of the most important publications in this regard by Pridgeon et al. And Bateman et al. in the journal Lindiana, which were more consolidated in 2003 with the paper by Bateman et al. So confirmed the polyphily and distribution of orchids into 3 distinct genera, namely Orchis, Anacanthis, and Neotinea. And so in that publication in 2003, the things were more consolidated, and giving this graph, this cladogram, in which we can find representatives of the former Orchis genus in 3 completely different sets. You see in completely different branches of the phylogenetic tree, one corresponding to what we call now Anacanthis, the second to Neotinea, and the third remaining Orchis. And to give an image of what happened, I take this graph, which has nothing to see with our situation, but can be used conveniently to show the situation that we have. So, formerly, the genus Orchis, Anacanthis, and Neotinea were such that only one species of Anacanthis was considered and only one species of Neotinea, while Orchis grouped a whole set of heterogeneous species that was clearly polyphyletic. And so we had to give up that idea and consider instead that Anacanthis grouped species, a monophyletic set of species, the same for Neotinea, and the remaining for Orchis. Seen in another way, that was the situation before 97, and the situation, with clearly there were some correspondences of a part of the Orchis with Anacanthis, because there was a set here of species which hybridized with Anacanthis and had the same chromosome number. The same with Neotinea. while for Aceras it was the contrary. Aceras hybridized with a part of the Orchis with the same chromosome number, and so therefore there was an incentive to put those species into Anacanthis, those species into Neotinea, and to put Aceras in the remaining genus Orchis, giving this. You can see the indication of chromosome numbers. But what remained problematic was the remaining genus Orchis, in the sense that there are clearly two groups in that new genus. One group is the so-called Orchis militaris group, including Aceras, and another group including the Orchis masculae and similar species. So, but until a given point, we could not separate those remaining species, because while the Orchis masculae group can be seen to be monophyletic, this was not the case for the remaining species, and taking these two parts as two different genera would imply a paraphyletic situation for the new genus Orchis. So that is why it was not further split. Kretschmer et al. Published an interesting book in 2007 in which they review all the species of the three new genera based on Bateman et al.'s classification, but nevertheless suggested two subgenera, one being the monophyletic set of Orchis mascula, the other being the paraphyletic group of Orchis militaris. And they suggested that classification on the right with the subgenus Masculae and the subgenus Orchis. So it was implicitly assumed that we could take a subgenus even if it is paraphyletic. And now, just to give illustration of the species that we find in those four sections, the three genera plus one of the genera including two sections or two subgenera. First, the Anacanthis, which is extremely heterogeneous in terms of morphology, but genetically well uniform, because all of those species hybridize among themselves. Hybridize, but generally do not lead to fertile offspring. So that is why we can still consider different species. By the way, all of those pictures were taken in Portugal. So we have Anacanthis pyramidalis at the top, Anacanthis morio, Anacanthis papilionacea that we saw today in abundance, Anacanthis collina, Anacanthis coriophora, and Anacanthis laxiflora, all taken in Portugal. If you want to know in which regions, I can tell you. Then the second genus, Neotinea, with Neotinea maculata, Neotinea cuconica, and Neotinea ustulata. And I think that all three pictures come also from Portugal. Then the genus Orchis, subgenus Orchis. In this we have Orchis militaris. Orchis militaris is the type of the orchid family. And here, to give another example, Orchis punctulata from Cyprus. And during this trip this year in Portugal, I had the chance to see other representatives, so brand new pictures. Orchis italica, Orchis anthropophora, and the hybrid between both, the hybrid between Orchis italica and Orchis anthropophora, to show an example of Orchis hybrid. And then the last subgenus Masculae, with Orchis mascula, Orchis quadripunctata, provincialis, Tyteca, Prisca, and Langi. And what is interesting to note with regard to these different genera or subgenera is the table of hybrids. So you can see in the triangles, you can see that inside a genus or a subgenus, the species can very widely hybridize, and even in one of the genera, genus Anacanthis, they can hybridize with Serapias, another genus, completely different genus, and I will return to this at the end of my speech. But what will be of interest for us in this perspective is that part of the table. You can see that between the two parts of the remaining Orchis genus, the subgenus Militaris and the subgenus Masculae, there are no hybrid records. But there have been some records when you have a question mark, but they are all doubtful, as I will show you a bit later. So there are no reliable record of hybrids between the two subgenera. Then Erich Klein in 2004 published a paper in which he proposed the classification of orchids into 4 sections corresponding to the 3 genera and the 2 subgenera that I mentioned. And I took contact with Erich Klein. We discussed it, and finally we came to this proposal. We published in 2 papers results of our analysis and proposing to describe the new genus Androrchis. I will pass rapidly on what happened in the first paper and then mostly retain the second paper. So in the first paper we created 3 new genera with the idea to maintain Anacanthis pyramidalis separated from the remaining set of the other species considered as Anacanthis in the new situation. The same with Odontorchis, and then Androrchis for the masculine group and the remaining Orchis for the Militaris group. But in the second paper, we somewhat revised our way of thinking and conformed to the proposal to have the broad Anacanthis genus and the broad Neotinea genus, but maintaining the distinction between Orchis and Androrchis. So after the publication of those papers, some other scientists contested our findings, and first of all Pierre Delforge, who rejects the new genus Androrchis, accepts the enlarged genus Neotinea, and as regards the Anacanthis, it goes much further than we did, and split it into 5 genera. So, in addition to Anacanthis sensu stricto, the genus Herorchis, Anteriorchis, Vermeulenia, and a new genus Paludorchis. But until now, only he and his close relatives accept that classifications. So to put it in another way, that is the classification proposed after publication of Bateman et al.'s paper with 3 genera. Then the first proposal by Erich Klein and myself to have 3 additional genera, but which we abandoned to give this, in which we conform to the classification of Bateman et al. Regarding Anacanthis and Orchidinae, but still would like to propose the splitting of Orchis into Orchis and Substructo and Androrchis. And the proposal by Delforge is no acceptance, maybe I should take this, no acceptance of the genus Androrchis, but splitting Anacanthis into 5 genera. Other contradictors, in which we find again Bateman, Richard Bateman, but also some well-known persons, Salvatore Cozzolino and Giovanni Scopece, and you see the title, Just What is a Genus, in which they contradict our proposal. He reminds the paraphilia of genus Orchis if the separation between Orchis and Androrchis is maintained, but that was the situation at that time. But later, the situation evolved, as you will see, and to reinforce their conclusions, they made some mortality tests of hybrids artificially produced between representatives of the different genera. So, of course, we have this, which I already showed, showing that if we separate Androrchis and Orchis, Orchis cannot be monophyletic, and these are the results of the mortality tests of embryos, in which mortality is only moderate between Orchis and Substructo and Androrchis. But even so, now I go somewhat outside of the Scopece et al.'s analysis. Even so, even if there is a moderate mortality, and so that seemingly viable embryos are produced, in the nature it was never proved that natural hybrids could be found in the nature. So no reliable hybrid between these the 2 genera could ever be found in the nature. To go on with the chronology, this was another important paper by Inda et al. In 2012, in which their focus was not to clarify the situation within Orchis. The focus was somewhat different, but even though the sampling of species was incomplete, came to the conclusion that the 2 sections of Orchis are monophyletic. So it is a byproduct, secondary conclusion of their paper is this. Here it appears that the 2 sections or subgenera are monophyletic. In 2002 also we published a paper with some colleagues, with students. It was mainly in the scope of a master thesis of Manon Senos, and with our Flemish colleague Hans Jacquemin from the Flemish Catholic Université Leuven. We took the question again and from a multi-dimensional point of view. So not only molecular phylogenetics, but other standpoints. On molecular standpoints, we could obtain again monophyletic orchids and androrchids. But besides, we added some results of morphometric studies and some standpoints found in the literature about pre- and post-zygotic isolation between the two genera. So, using techniques, appropriate techniques that use the data, the Bateman et al.'s 2003 original data, the same data, we came to the conclusion of monophyletic androrchids and orchids. And we considered other standpoints. And first of all, morphometric standpoints, and here I only take a sample of the publication which Anna mentioned at the beginning, the Orchid Flora of Portugal, published in 1998. I had already performed at that time intensive multivariate morphometric studies on Dactylorhiza, but this figure includes also samples of the Orchis genus, the previous Orchid genus. And we can see that the representatives of Orchis militaris, Orchis Masculae group, and Orchis morio group were located very far apart from each other, compared to the Dactylorhiza, which formed a big conglomerate in which, nevertheless, we could see a clear structure. So we performed analysis on several species of both Orchis and androrchids. This is for the genus Orchis, like Orchis italica, Orchis militaris, Orchis simia, Orchis anthropophora, and Orchis purpurea. In androrchis, Androrchis langei, Mascula, Albiensis, Provincialis. And since then there have been other species than these, and not only these species were considered. We could identify important character differences when you see only at the shape of the lip. You see the shape of the lip of Orchis militaris is a so-called anthropomorphic silhouette with arms and legs and even a small appendix and legs. While for androrchids we have a completely different shape. So look also at the size of the spur, very long for androrchids and much shorter for orchids, among other differences. Also differences in the bract size. This is very typical. And so, based on a set of approximately 30 characters, we produced morphometric analysis like this, the principal component analysis showing that the masculae, or androrchids, I will use alternatively the term masculae and the term androrchis to designate the set of species belonging to the Orchis masculae group, show more conformity with representatives of the Anacanthis, but Anacanthis based only on the Morio group, Anacanthis Morio group. This is another principal coordinate analysis showing the same kind of results. And as you can see, the set of characters, if we want to distinguish between masculae and orchis, for example, taking only the first two characters, the spur length and the length of the lip medial lobe, we can completely classify correctly all of the species in the two genera. While if we take Anacanthis in addition, we should have 5 characters to correctly classify all representatives. So the results of the morphometric study were clear and explicit. Also cluster analysis showing again there is more similarity between the Masculae and Anacanthis than with the remaining Orchis species. Now, other arguments produced by other researchers. First, the seed micromorphology, which is a specialty of a team of Roberto Gamarra from Spain, showing that there is a clear distinction between the two sections. And by the way, Gamarra finally was one of the supporters of our splitting between Orchis and Androchis. So he agrees with us. And if you go on the site Orchideas Ibericas, the internet site Orchideas Ibericas, the classification there is already based on Orchis and Androchis. Other arguments. Prezygotic isolation, observing the pollinators. We can see that Orchis masculae, which is representative of Androchis, and 3 other species have a different spectrum of pollinators. For example, in a student's thesis made in our university, it was found out that Orchis masculae was pollinated mainly by dipterans, while in the other species we have both hymenopters and coleopters coming into play. Now, post-zygotic arguments. First, non-viability of hybrids. Even though, as I mentioned, there was moderate viability of embryos, natural hybrids were never found in nature, but sometimes you can see publications showing so-called hybrids between Orchis and Androchis. But if we see the pictures on which this is based, they are clearly not, for the orchid specialist, they are clearly not hybrids, they are simply malformations of very clear species. This one, the so-called hybrid between Masculae and Militaris, is clearly Militaris, a misformed malformation of Orchis militaris, and the same here. This is clearly a malformation of Orchis purpurea and not a hybrid between Orchis purpurea and Orchis pixelii. Though I consider those hybrids as absolutely unlikely. I have tried to find an English term that would translate correctly the French word invraisemblable. I didn't find any single English word that would mean the same. And we need to take 2 words, absolutely unlikely. A second post-zygotic argument is the way the different species of Orchis and Androchis form association with mycorrhizal fungi. And this is a result of a paper published by Jacquemin et al. Jacquemin, our colleague from the Flemish University of Louvain, showing that obviously the species from the Masculae group, what we call Androchis, associate with few associate with only few species of fungi, while the representatives of the Orchis sensu stricto associate, they are more generalist and associate with more species of fungi. Giving this diagram in which we can compare the total number and the average number of operational taxonomic units of fungi that associate with species of Orchis or Androrchis. So, but having published this, again we had another contradiction, but that's science, that's research, scientific research. Again by Bateman, subjective critique of the recent contributions, circumscribing genera in the European orchid flora. So he criticized about the results of our study, including the one published in Phytotaxa. He said this: only one group species is needed to root the trees, but a larger number of out groups is needed to test the monophyly of the in-group. And indeed, the phylogenetic tree that I showed, published in Phytotaxa, there was only one external outgroup, which is Traunsteiner. He says that the results from gamma height R study are inconsistent. He says also that we can agree, of course, the intrinsic properties should be preferred over extrinsic properties. We tried to do that, of course. We didn't try to promote the post-zygotic or pre-zygotic information that I mentioned as being dominant. They are simply supporting the results. But so with this we can agree. We can agree also with this, of course, that we should never prioritize morphological aspects with respect to molecular aspects, but since now the molecular aspects shows also that we have a splitting. And the last remark is this one, because in the paper published in Phytotaxa, we advocated that to be consistent with the global classification, we should split Orchis and Androrchis. He says the contrary. Ironically, it is because I subscribe to the same primary goal of achieving a consistent genus level classification that I continue to oppose the segregation of Androrchis from Orchis. So now to relieve a little bit the atmosphere of this speech, you may think maybe that there is a war, a perpetual war among researchers, but this is not the case. As I will show you, we are a very kind group of scientists which discuss and which confront our positions. And indeed, as you can see, some months ago I had my retirement ceremony, during which I invited some scientists who accepted very kindly to come and present speeches, including the famous Bateman, a very kind person with whom I have very good relationships. So the person sitting in the back, Fabiana. You have Hans Jacquemin, of course, he was our ally in these studies, from Louvain, and other Swedish and Dutch colleagues, and Walloon colleagues, and friends since many years, Jean-Louis Gatois. So now I would like to come to a conclusion. And first, maybe compare the situation that happens between Orchis and Andorchis to other pairs of genera, and consider again the problem of consistency of classification. And I would like also to refer to the definitions of genus and subgenus. In fact, what is a subgenus? We will see in a few minutes. But first, to compare the situation that happens between Orchis and Andorchis with two other examples of pairs of genera. Anacanthis versus Serapiaceae, Dactylorhiza versus Gymnadenia. As I mentioned, the hybrids between Orchis and Andorchis are unknown or extremely doubtful, while between the other pairs of genera there are many reported and described, which does not mean that they are frequent, but many situations of such hybrids have been described and documented, and clearly documented. For Portugal, for example, there is one example here in the Serrabulage of hybrid between Dactylorhiza erycetorum and Gymnadenia conopsea. And you can see that in Orchis and Andorchis, the factors that would favor the appearance of hybrids are frequent, so both act as food deceit, the common habitats are very frequent, and the phenology is almost identical. While there is not such easy situations for the other two pairs of genera, but nevertheless they produce hybrids. So, in terms of consistency, that would favor the separation of Orchis versus Andorchis. So one of the problems here is that Anacanthis and Serapias on the one hand, and Dactylorhiza and Gymnadenia on the other hand, are genera that are well known since a very long time ago. So their distinction is not put into contradiction. While this is a new proposal that goes against the commonly accepted classification. Now, the definition of a genus by Stussy. So, to recognize genera, we should have three conditions. The phenetic gap between genera, which should be larger than between species of the same genus, which is indeed the case, as we have seen by the morphometric analysis. The holophyletic, that is monophyletic nature of genera, and it is the case, and other elements of information that will help to improve the comparisons among taxa for purpose of generic circumscription. That is why I've tried to do with the other arguments, which are not priority but help to support the distinction. So we conform. Now, what is a subgenus? And here it is much more vague, as you will see. This is one definition. An occasionally used taxonomic category ranking between a genus and a species. Another, a subordinate genus, a section or subdivision of a genus higher than a species. Since there is no fixed definition of a genus, there can be none of a subgenus, and thousands of groups in zoology formerly regarded as subgenera or disregarded entirely are now named and held as to be genera. In botany, a subgenus is a section of a genus so strongly marked as to have plausible claims to be itself an independent genus. So These are two examples, maybe two caricatural examples of definition, but you find this. So, conclusions. Our conclusion is to promote genera, of course, seeing this. But probably you are aware of this important publication that is now completed, the genera Orchidaceae by a team of researchers from Kew, the Kew Botanic Gardens in Britain. And they have a well-established list of genera, and we cannot go outside of that list. It seems that we have to conform absolutely to that list. And again, this is the last remark made by Bateman, by Richard Bateman. Perhaps by some miracle we can now agree that the genus-level circumscription of European orchids as summarized in the global General Orchidaceae project is already optimal. So they would like to close definitely the debate on the genera. No new proposal would be admitted. Now you can ask to me, is it important, the subgenus or genus? That is, everybody can have a different opinion on that. So it is not worth doing research for that. I leave it to your reflection, and after showing a picture with an Orchis and Orchis side by side, I hope you can find a language which you can recognize. And I wonder if you can recognize each of these languages. And that's it. Thank you.